Okay, so the president won't leave us alone. Seriously. This time on Poll Hub, Trump keeps tweeting about a poll we did with NPR and the PBS NewsHour, and he keeps getting it kind of wrong. But he has forced journalists to look in the mirror and ask how well they cover polls. How well do they know them? We have the head of a major journalism organization here to talk with us about it. But first, Starbucks for president? The ex-CEO of Starbucks says he might run as an independent. So what is the modern history of third-party runs? We've got the details. Lots to discuss, so let's get started. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
Do you want to run for president, Lee? You could run as a third-party candidate.
Yeah. I'm not thinking of it because it seems like that seat has already been taken, perhaps. Someone's thinking about that.
By Howard Schultz.
Everybody's doing it.
Well, there's things brewing in that regard.
The former Starbucks CEO, Howard Schultz, the coffee magnate, brewing, we got it, is saying he may run as a third-party candidate in 2020. That gave us an opportunity to go back and look at third-party candidates. I want to do, I just want to be, again, full disclosure here. In 1980, it was my first year to vote. I was 18 years old, and I voted for John Anderson because I was, young and wanted to be an iconoclast. I'm not going to go with the Republicans or the Democrats. I'm going to vote for the guy.
And you didn't worry about whether you were going to be a spoiler for somebody?
No, I didn't at all.
Hang on.
Yes, okay, Barb, go for it.
If Anderson had not been a candidate, would you have voted?
Yes. Oh yeah, no, it was ingrained in me. I would have been killed by my parents if I hadn't voted.
And so you would have likely voted for one of the
I would have voted for one of
party-
the major party candidates.
So
yes.
the question is, when looking at these independent efforts, not necessarily how many votes they get, because very often, like Jill Stein, 5% last time. They don't get a lot of votes necessarily. The question is, where are they getting them? And if you're getting these votes in a place like Florida or in this last election, Michigan or Wisconsin, you can make the difference between who takes the oath of office and who doesn't. So I think when people get concerned or welcome the emergence of a guy like Schultz into this, potentially, he doesn't say he's running, definitely.
But he'd be self-funded.
Yeah, self-funded, and the notion is, would he in fact serve the role as a spoiler? Now, in 1982, I used the word spoiler and was castigated in local press because, why was I condemning someone? And spoiler is a political term, meaning he would ruin it for someone else. It doesn't mean he's a bad person.
Right, and you're not saying,
but
and you're not favoring the
here,
person that he's not spoiling.
Part of the debate here is what really is the role of third-party candidates. Mm-hmm. And we've heard lots of arguments. For instance, Ralph Nader, who was, blamed by Democrats to have served the 2000 election to George Bush because in several key states, he did attract more support than he did nationally, and people thought that those would have been votes that would have gone to Al Gore. So he's made the argument that in fact he brought people into the process who may not have voted. So that is one argument. And then the other argument is that, you are pulling from one of the two major candidates, as you indicated.
Disproportionately.
Jay, that you would have voted.
Okay, so to give Schultz his fair due here, he says he's going to potentially run as an independent. He's saying people have said of him that there's 40% of independents in the country, and therefore if he goes to the middle and runs as a centrist, he's got a great opportunity.
Yeah.
The reality in the numbers is that there really aren't there. Independents are a group where many of them are, in fact, more leaning towards Democratic or Republican Party. They're not pure centrist independents. The number's far less than the 40.
Well, back in the day, an independent used to be someone who really didn't identify with either party, but that's changed.
But now, so we asked that question for people to identify themselves, and people have, over the last few years, been identifying themselves less often as Democrats and Republicans and more often as independents. But the fact is, most of them are probably, of that 40%, they're registered as either Republicans or Democrats in most cases. And then when we ask them to lean, the independents fall away to a very small percentage.
And look, there's damaged party labels right now, and there will be some attraction for someone who's not a Democrat or Republican. But again, the question, because what impact does that have? And, the Ross Perot thing, that was interesting.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Did.
That's the only election at least in the last 50 or 60 years that I think there's a pretty fair argument to be made that Ross Perot, in getting 20%, the highest number that a third-party candidate
1 in
had gotten,
5
that
voters.
more of those would have gone to Bush than would have gone to Clinton. And I don't think even Clinton's people deny that. But George Wallace got a huge vote, but Nixon still won. Well, Wallace wasn't drawing people from Humphrey, probably,
Well,
right?
but he was
Anderson
drawing,
didn't make
think
Reagan the president.
He was drawing Democrats.
Some Southern
and he was,
whites,
and
right.
he was drawing Southern Democrats.
But they weren't going to vote for Minnesota
And I
liberal
think,
Hubert Humphrey.
and I think that is one of the things that we do see over time when we look at third-party candidates, not just nationally, but even in some local elections, that very often what does happen is that they draw support from the candidate who has a problem with part of his or her base. And so there's more of a dislike for the major party candidate, and so it's a place for those people to go rather than kind of holding their nose and then pulling the lever for the major party
I think the Ross Perot
candidate.
thing was also the exit polls showed him polling fairly evenly from both, but people felt that he changed the tone of the campaign by when he got in, when he got out, what he did, what he didn't do, and they do change debates sometimes when polls are used to, get people into debates, and then it becomes a whole different dynamic, and that happened in the Reagan-Carter year with Anderson. There was a whole debate over the debates, and that really affected the contest because of whether Anderson was included in that or not.
In 1992, when Bill Clinton won with 43% of the vote, it had been a long time since a Democrat had won, and certainly a long time since a Democrat had gotten majority support.
Yep.
So that really was the influence of Ross Perot.
And Woodrow Wilson would not have been president had Teddy Roosevelt not split the Republican vote by running on the Bullmoose Party in 1912. And that, I think, may be the last word on this. Can I say it's the last word for myself and for you and you? Okay, that's it.
And as we mentioned last week, the president has taken a liking or something to the Marist Poll, and he keeps tweeting about us. A particular poll that we did with NPR and the PBS NewsHour, and it was a national poll. We do national polls all the time, but this particular national poll, which was not favorable in almost any way for the president, he or somebody on his staff pulled out a piece of the poll that regarded Latinos, and he claimed that Latino support for him was essentially, had gone through the roof from one poll to the next. And as we pointed out last week when we first raised it, that's kind of a misreading of how polls work when you're doing a national poll. But he tweeted again about it, and there's been a lot of attention and a lot of focus on how we read polls, how journalists, and as a political reporter for a long time, I know that I never knew as much as I do now about reading political polls. So we invited on the president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, Hugo Balta. And to be fair, Hugo, I just want to let everybody know that we worked together back in the day at NBC. So, full disclosure, we know each other.
Does that mean you have to recuse yourself from the discussion?
I can, but I'm not playing it. Anyway, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
So this poll, let me just put it in context. The number that the president pulled out was the Latino support for him, the approval rating among Latinos for him, which was higher in this poll than it had been in our prior poll. And as we pointed out at the time, this was a very small group of people within the larger context of the poll. We poll 1,000 people, we interview 1,000 people, and this was a pretty small number. But it's raised a lot of hackles. You and your organization, it was set about the way that the president characterized it and the way that the poll is read. Tell us about what you're concerned about.
Sure. Look, I think the first part is polling is very complex. And you even said you certainly have a greater appreciation for polling than you did when you were a reporter in New York. And so certainly the methodology, the process for polling is not turnkey. It's not very easy to digest. The second thing is it's in any situation with numbers, people can manipulate it, right? They extract what they need, and they frame a story. And certainly one of the main concerns for the National Association of Hispanic Journalists is in the framing of the poll. Certainly we have questions about the poll itself, but you mentioned the president, and the president having in the last couple of days tweeting the poll and really framing the story in regards to the Latino community supporting him. That comes from how it was framed in Fox News in telling that same story. Look, no big secret, right? We know the president is a big fan of Fox News. And so there's the trickle down effect, right? There's the poll, which is filled with information. It is then what is extracted from Fox News, and then what is extracted further by the president, and then creating a frame that is incorrect, as you said. And actually, the numbers say the contrary to what the president is saying. So I think for us as a journalism organization, it's always in demanding better of journalists and asking them to fact check. And not just in the information that's being given to them by lawmakers or the White House, but also the information that they're gathering in telling their stories. And I think here's an example of, again, in this particular case, Fox News extracting information and not necessarily putting it into context.
And we completely agree. We often have those issues. On the one hand, public polls, and we believe this very strongly, should be very transparent about their methods and their results. Because quite frankly, journalists can't really ascertain what the poll is about if you don't know the who, what, when, and what, how and why of the poll. But I think organizationally, you guys also had some concerns, not just about Fox News, but also about our polls. So here we are. I'm the director of the Marist Poll, and Lee is the director of the Institute here. So give it to us. Tell us,
Sure.
Tell us what we did wrong.
I have to go right now. Sorry.
Look, I think and I think, you say the word wrong, and I've certainly read your comments in regards to intent versus impact, right? The intent is certainly not what the impact is. I do, and I do understand this is not a poll that is specific to U.S. Hispanics. In fact, this is about Americans, and part of the poll includes Hispanics. And so I understand that. But I think the larger discussion is that whether it's a poll squarely focused on Hispanics, and we can talk about geography, we can talk about language and those types of polling, even in this poll, there needs to be some sensitivity in producing a poll that, while not intended to be specific to Hispanics, when in reaching that community, there has to be stronger filters, including language, in order to, as best as possible, regardless of being transparent with plus or minus points of accuracy, in order to be better. And what we feel in our position is this poll could have been better if there were more focus on providing a more accurate picture, however small, of the U.S. Hispanic population.
See, I think one of the issues here is that we cannot anticipate the reaction, let's say, of anybody, including, in this case, President Trump and Fox News. So what occurs is there's tons and tons and tons of data, of which there are even many, many, many questions in the survey. So he found the one kernel of data that he liked, and he went with it. We found out about it when you probably found out about it. There was no.
Well, there are a lot of subgroups that we look at in doing surveys, and it's demographic characteristics. It's also political party, and so I think it's very important for us as public polls to be very transparent and to to talk about and to allow people to look at these numbers and to have them available. No question, this is not the first time that someone has railed against us about some or questioned some of the numbers in our polling.
Or other public polls too. I mean,
Exactly.
because we're all
It
doing the
often
same thing.
But
happens-
some
in terms of a
samples do
national-
vary greatly
but
very
it often
often.
happens.
So it's a
It often
dangerous
happens,
thing to do.
particularly around election time, and it has to do with political party. But Hugo, I think you have a very significant concern here in the sense that when we're looking at a demographic group that is very diverse. It's diverse in terms of culture. It's diverse in terms of geography. It's diverse in terms of even language.
Language, yeah.
And so when
And I would add also race, because one of the other things about the poll is Latino is not a race. And I know that's part of the debate that's happening right now with the U.S. Census. We're a year away from the census, and I've forgotten how many times there's been a debate on how exactly they're going to categorize this very diverse group. So when you put Latinos as a race, as it was categorized in this poll as a race, it automatically is tainted.
And it was categorized in the tables. Actually, not in how we asked the question. When we asked the question of race, and this is part of how we're characterizing things, and I think this is a really great discussion because this is something that we can help work with you in terms of labeling and characterizing things and characterizing data. The way you're absolutely right. When we ask this question in our questionnaires, we don't include Latino as a race. In fact, we ask people what their race is, and then we ask them if they have a Latino background, and we give them a list of examples of countries from which we would consider their ancestry to be Latino. So you're absolutely right in the sense that we don't necessarily characterize it as race, but then when we look at the tables and we're trying to shorthand things and we think about what has occurred in the past and how ethnicity has been characterized in the past, it is labeled as white, African American, and Latino on our tables. And you're absolutely right about that.
I remember, when we were both working, in New York back in the day, that and in me covering politics, that there would be stories that I would do that would be about, the Puerto Ricans in the Bronx or the Dominican voters in, Washington Heights. And it wasn't so much Latino or Hispanic. We were doing it in New York because New York is so tribal and the politics are so tribal. We would break it down that way. And I do think there's a shorthand, and it's not just us. It's we can spread the blame, wide and far. That Hispanics or Latinos, depending on how you want to categorize that or use that word, is almost too broad to be useful. But everybody uses it, so what do we do?
Yeah.
Well, words matter,
Yeah.
and I think labels matter,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
we can be part of that.
But
We can
here's
be
another
part of that change.
misunderstanding very common in our polls also. So Asian Americans will call us and say, why were we not included in your poll? And the answer is, well, of course we spoke to Asian Americans, but that group is so small that it would
When
even
we
be
look at Americans
when
as
we
a
look at
whole.
Americans as a whole, that would even be a greater misrepresentation than what you're concerned about with this particular survey. So in a sense, I think it's very good to have an opportunity to clear the air. I might add also, not that I would rely on President Trump or Fox News necessarily to provide the full story on this, but within that same poll, which I think you guys may have mentioned in your release, that when we asked people the same survey whether they would definitely vote to reelect President Trump or definitely vote against President Trump, only 27% of Latinos said they would definitely vote to reelect him. He incidentally got 28% in 2016. And the majority, probably close to 2-1, said they would definitely vote against him. It's interesting as a kind of like a sub-finding of all this that although his approval rating was higher than it had been, perhaps obviously error margin notwithstanding, the people who say they're not exactly lining up the same people we talk to vote for his reelection. Obviously, the president and Fox News are not going to trumpet that.
Well, the thing,
Absolutely,
yeah.
and he used those numbers in a week when he was pushing. We were still under a government shutdown, and he was looking for ways to create a story about him having support, including Latinos, about his border wall. So again,
Oh, no
it's
question.
also how you manipulate the information. One of the things that was brought up that I wanted to touch upon is language. So in calling, and as you said, look, you make a phone call, you can't predict who's going to be at the other end of the line. But when someone picks up the phone, and in this conversation, we're talking about Hispanics, but really it could be any language. But if someone picks up the phone and they answer in Spanish, what happens next?
Well, you're absolutely right. And this survey of Americans was done of English speakers only. And what we do in our national polling is we speak with Americans in English, and this particular questionnaire and this particular survey was never intended to be a survey of the Latino community or anything else other than English speakers. And one of the things is that because we are we do explain our methodology, you know that. And I think it's important that people looking at any results and any survey results have a sense of who was polled, how they were polled, and when they were polled.
And we do employ Spanish speakers in some state polls, right? When there's
We always employ Spanish-speaking interviewers when we're doing our state polls, particularly around election time and when we're looking at particular policy issues and elections. So, for instance, if we are polling Texas, we're polling New York, we're polling Florida, we're polling California, Arizona. We certainly employ Spanish-speaking interviewers, and if someone does not speak the language that the interviewer is speaking, they will be directed to someone who can speak that language. But as Lee pointed out, and I think what you're alluding to as well, Hugo, is that there are many languages in this country. And certainly when you look at all national polls, all public national polls of Americans, many of them do include both English and Spanish-speaking interviewers. But beyond that, if you speak another language, you are not going to be represented in that poll.
Yeah. So it's not perfect in that regard. Two things are going to happen now. First of all, I appreciate this conversation, but two things are going to happen. One, we're going to do another national poll. And one thing that might happen is we may not get the threshold of Latinos in that survey to warrant their inclusion. Or maybe
in our tables.
In our tables.
Not as representative in the survey itself.
Or his approval rating could conceivably go down. Now, in those instances, in the first instances, the conclusion may be, well, that Marist Poll really learned its lesson because they're not even talking about him in the tables, which obviously won't be true. Or the president certainly isn't going to say, well, I was at 50 and now I'm at 28 or something. So, I mean, because the error margin's so wide, I think it's fair to anticipate that, this is, difficult to make a trend line out of, and the error margin's even wider when you compare poll to poll. It's different to make a trend line out of a subgroup without getting into
So
some
one thing that we've been doing here, and I just and we want to maybe wrap on this is we've been building out a curriculum and informational stuff for journalists, and that's part of me coming here has been to do that. But they've been doing this in the past. But what we want to do is we want to work more closely with people like you and journalists that aren't in associations, maybe with journalists in different organizations, to try and have the conversation move beyond who's up and who's down to like poll literacy. When a poll lands on my desk and I'm on deadline, I'm not going to have a lot of time to dig into it. How do we do a better job of getting that information out to journalists so that we're all working from the same kind of page in terms of our understanding of what polls do? And we'd love to work with you, in helping to implement some of that with the members of your organization.
And you're absolutely right. And we welcome the opportunity to work with you in exactly doing that. One of the things that every year the National Association of Hispanic Journalists hosts a national conference, and the conference is now very focused on training journalists to be better. Our expectation is they walk in with one set of tools and they're walking out with much more and applying it at work. Data journalism is essential for covering stories, for being more accurate, certainly to be fair in telling those stories. And so we would welcome the opportunity to work with you, to invite you to the conference, to integrate you into our curriculum in order to help journalists understand polling and also how to extract information as they're going to be telling stories for the 2020 election and the 2020 census.
And
so
therefore
thank you very
you can
much
tell
for that.
then you can tell the narrative that in its full context. So that would be very important, and we welcome that.
So I would volunteer for that. It's in San Antonio, and I like San Antonio, so I'm just putting my dibs in on that if we're going to go.
All right,
So,
all
yeah.
right.
Wow,
Hugo,
very nice.
Noted.
Thanks so much
Pollsters
for.
don't have such nice venues for their conferences.
Our conference is in Toronto this year. Good city,
Oh,
but
that's a
come
nice
on,
city.
it's not
That is
San.
a nice
It
city.
is. It's not San Antonio. Anyway, Hugo, thanks for coming on. Hugo Balta, president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Not the first conversation that we have had or that we're going to have, because I think we've all got some work to do, and I think this is actually the president has done us a favor in an odd way and put this on this issue on the table and got us talking. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. And thank you, Mary Griffith, our executive producer, and Kenny Marbles. Please do a good job as our editor.
Oh, he always does. We end up sounding much better than we do when we're doing the recording. You have noticed probably that we do a lot of discussion. We have a lot of discussions around polls in the past and trends. That is many thanks to the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University, where they have all of these archives of polls going back through the years, and they provide us with the ability to look back at time over time at survey questions and these results, and they really make our job a whole lot easier and make the show more interesting. So thanks, you guys.
And
at
we
Roper.
encourage you to send your questions to pollhub@marist.edu or reach out on us on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter or Marist Poll on Facebook. And if you want questions asked in polls or want us to bring in topics of conversation, we're happy to do that. You just got to let us know. For example, Ashley Soriano here, one of our newsfeed students, is right now plotting. She's still awake based on this. We didn't put her to sleep, but you're plotting a future segment perhaps. And there she goes. We'll be maybe talking to her on that in a few weeks.
And don't forget to subscribe.
Don't forget to subscribe. I forgot to tell them not to forget. Oh, well. See you next time.